Hi, I'm the Director of Outreach and Intervention at Exodus Cry, Helen Taylor, and I'm here on a Zoom call today with an amazing person who we've been connected with for several years, Youngbee Dale, who is a researcher and consultant with a specific focus on looking into the commercial sex market of Korean women in the US, as well as other factors and legislation that pertain to some of those issues. And we are really just so grateful for her expertise, the peer-reviewed articles that she has written, and just after all the events that took place in Atlanta last week, this has been something so heavy on our hearts and has really just brought to light in the national conversation about Asian massage parlors, the vulnerability of the women who are there, and the reality that sex trafficking is taking place in these places. And this is something that we really wanted to take a moment to speak to Youngbee about, and really invite her commentary and just have a conversation about some of these things that I've been really processing and thinking about, and just wanting to delve deeper in this moment in the national conversation where the focus is on all kinds of things. But as an organization that has been fighting sex trafficking since 2008 and has done outreach to massage parlors where women are being exploited, this is something that's been really just on our hearts. And so I wanted to just reach out to you, Youngbee. Thank you so much for being on this call, and just for sharing some of your insight with us today. I'd love to just hear how you began doing this research, and what are some of the main things that you found when you began researching this topic?
So I started this work in 2005 in South Korea, and my main clients were Filipino sex trafficking victims. At the time, I didn't know what sex trafficking was or human trafficking was, and I just kind of I joined the organization that I was working for to fight human rights in general, but not so much as sex trafficking. And somehow I ended up being with sex trafficking victims. And then when I went to grad school, my professor was passionate about sex trafficking. So I ended up writing some sort of a chapter contribution to her publication. And that was on global money laundering and sex trafficking. So from then on, starting 2009, I really focused on the study of sex trafficking market in the U.S. And I was a journalist at the time, and I have several trips to South Korea or other places to identify trafficking market and trends, and the factors that are involved in trafficking issue. And I noticed that there's gap between what we hear from the American newspaper as opposed to what's been reported in this either South Korean American community or the South Korean newspaper in general. So I figured I spoke with several experts in the field who have been in this fight since the 70s. So they're the ones who really started the whole anti-trafficking movement in the US. So they all told me that I need to write about this because nobody knows about this issue. So I felt responsible as someone who speaks Korean, who understands the culture and who understands the knowledge gap between what has been reported to American public as opposed to not reported to American public. So I decided to write a paper about it, and that became my first paper.
Well, I think that was around the time shortly after you released that. I think in 2017, you and I first connected. And that was around the time I formerly lived in Cambodia, and my first outreaches were actually there. And that was the first time that I was realizing that massage parlors could often be fronts for brothels, and brothel activity was taking place, but the adverts from the front were just that it was a massage parlor. And then moving to the US 8 years ago, realizing that this was happening over here as well, not just in Cambodia and Thailand and Korea, but across the US, there were massage parlors that were operating as brothels. And yeah, I would just be so interested to hear on some of the main things that your research even found, or what are some of the common situations that you found of trafficking of I know your focus was on Korean women specifically. what does trafficking look like in this context over here?
So trafficking of South Korean women, as opposed to other trafficking issues, a lot more complex because of the cultural barrier and language barrier that most people have as a nonprofit or legislators or even the law enforcement. The reason why the law enforcement is not able to investigate cases as sex trafficking as opposed to prostitution or prostitution related crime is because they have a hard time interviewing the victims from the perspective of victims, but no one, including the victims, do not understand, and they're designed not to understand to extent of the network and the depth of criminal techniques that the traffickers use to bring these women. So their main technique really involves the manipulation and deception. And that is not something that the victim understand. If the victim understood, then she would not have been in this place to be manipulated, right? That's the whole definition of deception. So that's one thing. The other thing is I noticed that even if the law enforcement or the law enforcement entity who's working with the translator who understand the language, who understand the cultural phenomena, I noticed that they're missing out a lot of details out of the survivor's testimony or what the survivors say. So now when it comes to trafficking person's language is very important. So in South Korean culture, Korean language is very different from English in a sense that they're not focused on, the language is not focused on expressing their own feelings and individualism, but that's not because that's not their culture. Their culture is their cultural identity, their identity as an individual, really closely tied to their family members, okay? So what they communicate is not always expressed. The way they communicate is through the tone or subtle body language or the cultural nuance that comes out of her mouth. So I noticed this translator, and she was a very good translator. She's talking to the survivor. I was supposed to be speaking English so that the other client can hear me talking. And when I hear the translator talking, I noticed that she's missing a lot of important details because she doesn't understand the criminal techniques behind it. And also the victims were not able to catch different phases, the little subtle techniques that the traffickers had been utilizing. And I just kind of had to stop her and say, pause it for a second. Did you have an inkling? Not no, okay? So she doesn't have the knowledge of these organizations. Did she have an inkling? Is there something different about the common knowledge as a Korean citizen? There's just something's up with, there's something inkling, right? And then because I use the word inkling, for instance, she started giving me all kinds of details about, you know what, I thought it was a little interesting. These two individuals, I didn't think that they're working together, but looking back, but maybe they were like working together. And it makes sense why she was telling me X, Y, Z. So these subtle techniques, it's not just about the language and cultural barrier. It's also the understanding of the whole lot of criminal tactics and the market itself. So I think because of these three challenges, the law enforcement is having a hard time prosecuting sex trafficking organizations.
Yeah, I think we've definitely found that and heard that feedback as well. And even just the culture of honor and shame that is so strong, it's a lot more difficult, it would seem, for victims who are being trafficked and exploited to come out with that testimony if it then affects the other women or even the owners, the sense of, you could say, misplaced loyalty towards them. They're not just considering their own freedom or rights or situation, but how that might impact those around them. And that's, I know that law enforcement have struggled to assist victims, partly when they haven't self-identified as trafficking victims, and some of them may not even know or understand or have that language, depending on the circumstance that they came over here. They may not even understand ways that the businesses are operating in illegal ways as well. And so, yeah, we found that we were wanting to go in and reach the women with love and support. And so I began going in, taking gifts of makeup and just wanting to connect with the women, wanting to try and have a conversation with them in where they weren't being listened to by the madame or those working around them. And as I'm sure you can imagine, when talking about translation and the language barrier, that was initially a big struggle. And so I ended up training two amazing Chinese American women. The massage parlors that we were going to were only had Chinese women. And so I think in different areas or cities or states and regions, there's that difference. But having Chinese native speaking women coming in alongside us, the difference was really just immediately noticeable. And so I just feel, even as far as anyone who is wanting to help the women or do outreach, I think that it's so important that it is South Korean women going to where there's South Korean women being exploited in these places, Chinese women going. And so myself as a director of outreach, who's always training people in how to best reach women who are being exploited, that's something that I'm very mindful of. There's the kind of the aspect of supporting the women and assisting them and creating environments where they feel they can reach out and trust. I was just thinking, if I was being trafficked in a place like this, who would I go to? All my potential relationships are the traffickers and other women being exploited with me. Would I go to the police? Would I have anyone outside of that bubble that I could trust and speak to? So we really wanted to go in with that intention to try and build trust and encourage them to connect with the Chinese women on our team outside of the massage parlors. But then we found that every few weeks the women were moved from place to place. And so it was very difficult to sustain those relationships. And I realized that was a real psychological technique to create that isolation and that sense of displacement of movement. And is that something that you have seen in your research of that intentional movement of women in different places in the city or country? And what are your insights into why you think that is?
So yes, the movement woman as a result creates the sense of displacement or isolation, and it confuses victims, and they're designed to be that way. The other reason why the traffickers, from the business operational perspective, for the traffickers, they need to find a new victims every once in a while, every 7 or 8 weeks. If I don't want to lose business, because the buyers, sex buyers, look for different women and different looks, or the services that the women can offer. So that's another reason why that traffickers move women around the nation.
Yeah, the Parlors project recently came out with a statistic that they estimated around 9,000. There are 9,000 massage parlors operating in an illicit way in the US. Have you heard similar statistics, or what kind of scale do you feel like this is happening, where there's exploitation taking place in massage parlors?
So their statistics is based on there's a website called robmap.com, and all this massage parlors are advertising. So they're counting these illicit brothels that are operated and advertised on that article. But that 9,000 massage parlors do not include the entire market of Asian brothels in the United States, and that are actually exploiting and trafficking the victims. So there are 9,000 plus brothels that are advertised all over the United States and operating and making profit off of exploiting victims. The second thing, they estimated the 2.5 billion for the size of the market. Their estimate is based on their calculation of how much will be tip, how much a tip involved, how much do they charge for services, how many workers do we see on average per parlor, right? So that is very different from what I get from the Korean government statistics, which is way bigger than 2.5, solely because the way they calculated this market size is not just based on the service providers and the survivors intel, like Parlors. But the other report that came out of Korean government counted, reverse counted what will cost to run the brothel based on their interview with the brothel owner. So that includes how much do we pay for bouncer, the rent, and how much condom do we pay, and how much do we charge the woman, and how much do you pay for the manager, and what will be the cost of the lawyers, accountants, and what will be the cost of the transportation. So all this operational costs that are combined, that they estimated per brothel is minimum, they made $500,000 per year to $1 million.
Wow.
So you can imagine 500,000 times the 9,000 massage parlor will be a lot more than 2.5 billion.
Yeah, that is really staggering. And what would you say to the question of, well, how do you know if a massage parlor is illegitimate or legitimate? How would you define a legitimate massage parlor as opposed to one operating in an illegal or illicit way? And are some Asian or Korean run massage parlors completely above board with no exploitation taking place?
I will say, in my opinion, massage parlors have always been the type of brothels that operated to exploit Asian women. It's starting all the way back to Japanese colonization. So when whoever brought the massage parlor industry here is through the women that are already being trafficked or prostituted by the military guys, and they came here with a fraudulent marriage. And these women got married to these men, and sometimes they did it on there's a legitimate relationship, but other times I know specific cases and it's documented, these women are essentially trafficked, and the military guys are utilized as the brokers, and they made a lot of money off of selling this woman to massage parlors. So you can imagine that my take on the massage parlor is really not the legitimate massage parlor places, as opposed to I consider that as a brothel. The second thing is when people say that, you don't know if these places are legit or not legit. You don't know if these women are prostituting on their own. These people don't understand the perspective of the Asian woman, period. So the Asian women, with the traditions they have, what they grew up with, and how they speak to other people, do not prostitute on their own. If they ever advocate, those are not the survivor of sex trafficking. These are the people who probably have never been in prostitution of Asian massage parlors. These are generally just people recently unnoticed as people who are educated from the Western culture, and they have been scholars who are not affected by the real trauma of sex trafficking or prostitution. So I'm very passionate about speaking the truth in love. I am very passionate about the Western influence of silencing the hardship of victims of sex trafficking from the Asian countries. So you can imagine how I feel when people come out and say, well, this is racism. You can't say that these women are not doing this on their own. They're legitimate massage parlor. You can't say that. So I refer them back to the history of the United States, what they have done to the Asian women. And I also refer them back to the Asian history and how they've been treating women from the Confucius mindset.
When people say things like that as well, that the website you referenced earlier, Rub Maps, I spent a few hours when we were researching which massage parlors to connect with and visit women in our city when we began 4 years ago. I used Rub Maps as a way to try and research where are the places we should go, and reading some of the reviews, because buyers can leave reviews on this the subscriber member only website. It was one of the most disturbing things that I've ever read. Any type of sex by a hobbyist board very disturbing. The kind of the derogatory comments they make about women, but I just noticed how analytical and of specific body parts they were in the reviews on Rub Maps, and some of the language did seem racist. So I think to your point earlier, what I've seen in the last few days is the media wanting to just frame this as a racist hate crime, like that being the primary motivation of the shooter in Atlanta. And I think there's so many more factors at play, and he himself has admitted to being a sex buyer at some of these places, and he also admitted to watching pornography several hours a day. And I feel like that is a really important component of this entire case. And the fact that Pornhub, the website that we've been campaigning against the last year, within their top 10 most searched for items in 2019 that they released, the number 1 search was Japanese, and I think number 5 and 6 were Asian and Korean. And so the promotion of the sexual fetishization of Asian women through pornography is definitely a huge factor at play in this, that leads to the demand of sex trafficking. That the history and the understanding the context, like you said, Youngbee, is so important, and also the current marketing that is driving buyers to purchase women at these places, to seek them out, I am certain is related to the pornography addiction that creates this certain fantasy that they want to go out and act out in real life on a real woman. And the women that I met and spoke to, I remember asking each one of them what their experience was moving to the US, and are they happy living here. Every person I asked that question to said they weren't happy, and I was even surprised that they were being that open with me, sharing their experience, and just some of the places we went to, they immediately would say, oh, no women are allowed, we don't service any women. And I had to explain I was here with a couple of friends, we were bringing gifts, we just wanted to leave them with the women. But that was telling to me as well, that a lot of these places, they are set up to just receive male sex buyers, and just how little protections the women have. What are some of the, like, do you feel that women are able to put up any boundaries if a sex buyer is offering a large tip? Like I guess my question is, how much of the pressure to perform non-consensual sex acts is coming from the sex buyers versus the owners of these locations, the traffickers, pressurizing the women to offer that?
So
if you answer that.
I think it's because how do I explain? So I know that a lot of people understand that, Asian sex trafficking has a lot to do with debt bondage, prostitution, right?
Can you talk to that a bit for people who might not understand that?
So debt bondage, prostitution, people say, is referred to the putting women into a lot of debt, and then to pay off the debt, the women are coerced into prostitution. So this is the general knowledge among at least the anti-trafficking world, to understand what is debt bondage, right? But what they don't understand, how does this complexity of debt bondage really works in favor for the traffickers or the manager employers, right? So the way it works is that, and I can give you an example. So I ask you, so you need a loan for plastic surgery, or you need a loan because you need to get a job. And in order to get a job in South Korea, a lot of time women need plastic surgery because they're looking for beauty rather than the capacity as an individual or woman to be able to perform at the job. So a lot of time women get plastic surgery to meet a better man, to get married, or to get hired by certain companies. So most of the time they don't have money They don't have money to go out and get $20,000-$30,000 worth of plastic surgery. So what they do, and they look for these. They're not looking for these advertisements. There's advertisement all over the website and saying that here we have this loan available just for the plastic surgery. So say that this woman take out the $20,000, then this loan shark will say, hey, you can, this is $20,000, then you can just work part-time at a restaurant, then you'll be able to pay out real quick. And we have this job opportunity for you, and you can work your way up, and then you can pay off debt, and then you move on. And then they said the interest rate is 10% out of $20,000. So if you think about the initial approach, it really makes sense. It just said, okay, so if I take out $20,000 and they're gonna charge me 10% for my interest, even though that's a little higher than what I would get in the US, but that's just, okay, it's not too bad. But they don't realize that the brothel has a control over when she can work and she cannot work. The day she cannot work, that's the day she cannot work, the interest and loan amount don't go away. So say that she owes 10% of the interest rate per day, the one day, Monday. So she pay $2,000, right? So pay up $2,000 plus principal. And she doesn't get to work on Tuesday because the madam was upset at her, right? Mm-hmm. Then the next day that becomes a compound interest. Now she owes $20,000 plus $2,000, so $22,000 times 10% of $22,000. That make sense? Yeah. So madam eventually wants you to. So basically, it's telling you, like, if you prostitute, if you engage in prostitution, that I know so and so pay up, the debt like in 2 months, that she's out of it. And I know so and so who did this, and now she's out of debt. And initially, if the woman doesn't respond, then the madam will started not scheduling her from working. And what happens is that she's finding out, the madam will not tell her and say, if you don't do this, then I'm gonna do this, right? It's just gonna be happening. So it's very subtle approach in the context of debt bondage or manipulation to exploit her to prostitute or engage in sex trafficking activities.
And that's such the exploitation of vulnerability of someone who is in a new country and being told this, just that you just see the vulnerability of how they could be manipulated. And if they're told, well, now you owe us money and here's a pathway to pay it back. I mean, we see this in sex trafficking cases around the world, and not just in this situation, but that debt bondage being something that is lorded over victims. When we were in Russia 2 years ago for the World Cup, we were encountering many Nigerian women who had been brought over for the World Cup expecting to be plugged in various different African businesses, is what they were told, and were told that their sponsor fee for coming over was between $30,000 and $50,000, and this was the only way that they could pay it back. And that just makes me always so angry of that the most vulnerable who don't feel that, like, they don't feel they have any other choice. They don't feel they can say no. There's elements of fraud, false pretenses. I mean, even just what you shared about the plastic surgery being a motive that that traffickers and recruiters are using to try and lure women is such a devastating aspect of the patriarchy, of holding up this standard of how a woman should look and say, you can't get ahead in life, you can't get married, you can't have a job without that. Like, that is a very tragic element that I hadn't even considered in connection with this. So thank you for mentioning that. With the post that we are about to share, or did share, I was sent it a few days ago from a South Korean woman who gave me full permission to share it. And it was basically the story of her friend's mother, who was exploited and trafficked into one of the 3 brothels one of the 3 Asian massage parlors in Atlanta, that one of which we now know was at one time operating as a brothel with certainty. And this friend's mother was I'm not sure how old she was, in her 40s or 50s, but she was being exploited there for many years, and it took her daughter having to save up enough money to buy her back. That's the language she used, buy her back. And so, it was such a personal story that really hit home the humanity of the plight of not only the women in brothels in Atlanta, but in massage parlors across the US. So we wanted to share that story as a really powerful insight into this really was connected with human trafficking, and this is something we desperately need to be talking about more in the anti-trafficking movement and in our culture. And so I just wondered, is that something that you commonly see, that like how do women get out of this? How do they escape? Is it only by paying back that debt bondage, having someone buy it out, their visa expiring? Like, how do women get out of this situation after they've been exploited in these places for several years?
They can't, so there are some incidents, they have different, they talk about it, well, survivors say one thing, right? But the Korean government says something else. Right. So in some cases, a woman committed suicide because they can't get out. So it's, they don't have freedom, they don't have choice, and they're just miserable. And at the end of the day, and they can't handle the pressure and stress of engaging prostitution against their will. And finally, they, a lot of victims, in fact, committed suicide. That's documented in fact. And the other thing is, some of the women who been prostituted in one area in the U.S., eventually they pay back. And then some people run away. And then in some ways, they find themselves being re-trafficked because they don't see any other way to go about it. And they just stick around with people that they know. And generally, who they know and what they connect with, they speak the language, the person that they can trust and have a relationship, are really in somewhat connected within the commercial sex market. So at the end of the day, they're actually moving from one perpetrator to another perpetrator. And this is based on actual case. So it really depends on the individuals. And other time they get married to one of the buyers, and then they get out. So it really depends on the case.
Wow. Do you feel that there is enough government services offered to support women? Like, what would you want to see change from both supporting the women and preventing these places from operating as they are?
I think that the law enforcement needs to step up, and I'm talking about not just the local law enforcement, I'm talking about the federal law enforcement. I have several friends who used to work at DOJ as a federal FBI agent, and I have seen cases that I work with these people. And I, in fact, it's not just one or the other administration, it's just in general, this has not been their priority. So for instance, that there are 10 agents working in, corruption section or some sort of section, right? And then they have department for human trafficking, but it's not dedicated to human trafficking. They deal with racism, human trafficking, and, others, social warfare, whatever everything under the sun that falls into civil rights category. That's where the human trafficking falls. So the number of agents that are dedicated to fight this organized crime are limited. And because they have so limited resources, the U.S. attorney doesn't have enough resource and time and energy to go after these bad guys. But looking at the Korean sex trafficking organization and the organized crime that are well connected to the political figures in South Korea, these political figures and some of the people who work in the companies that we are very well aware, if I mention their name, they're considered untouchable. Okay, the only people who can take down these people are really the U.S. government, who's supposedly leading the movement against human trafficking. So thankfully the Korean government, depending on the U.S. government a lot in many ways, and we have influence and more of like power to recommend. I wouldn't say power, but like more of a saying to what the Korean government should do. And thankfully, Korean government listened to U.S. government. Now, as a Korean private citizen, if I were to report the case and ask the government to pursue the case, they're not gonna listen to me. I will be powerless. But as a number of U.S. citizen, if you go up to the U.S. government, the U.S. government is imposing these recommending certain standards for going after certain people who are otherwise untouchable. There's a better possibility to go after these trafficking organizations. And my desire and hope is that the US government will take more active and proactive roles transnationally, but also domestically to go after the traffickers. And a lot of time when I train around the nation and these law enforcement at all levels, their biggest struggle is that they don't understand it. They don't understand the language. No, they're not trained, and they're not given the time and energy to spend on this issues, but they're very complex organizations. So my desire and hope is that the government will spend a little more resources to strengthen this law enforcement to go after these trafficking organizations.
Yeah, that's so important. And hopefully, my hope, even in the midst of such a tragic event of what happened last week in Atlanta, is that this is coming more to light, more to the surface of national conversation. And my hope is that conversations like this and others happening across the nation are bringing this more into light, because I've been shocked at the lack of knowledge or understanding that exploitation and trafficking could be taking place at these locations. Still to this day, many people are shocked when I tell them that. They just don't assume that there could be actual brothels around the corner, at the strip malls, when they see the massage parlors with the neon lights and shut down windows. It's not even occurring to them that this could be a brothel. There could be real victims being exploited there. Although it doesn't take a whole lot of research to begin to realize that there is exploitation taking place here. Do you think that it's possible to enforce sanctions of protection to massage parlors, that they could continue to exist, but they are protecting the women, like that there's a safe and ethical way? Or do you think that the types of buyers, people like Robert Long and others who are going to these places, have violent, exploitative expectations and intent? I suppose the question is, are there restrictions that could be placed on massage parlors to allow them to continue in an ethical way? Or do you think that that's an impossible expectation?
In terms of legislation?
Yeah.
I think you're familiar with what we tried with the massage parlors. They've tried a fire code. They tried a license regulation. What else did they try? They try city ordinance that pertaining to zoning. They try all kinds of regulations to regulate this massage parlors, but that hasn't been as successful as they first initiated or expected to work out. The reason why it wasn't successful is because, again, it's just connected to bigger network that has a lot of money. They can hire lawyers who can go find the loopholes behind these organizations or the regulation that's in place. So now really I'm going back to DOJ problem, or the federal government that needs to step up a little bit to put some more intels and or agents, at least 10 agents that are dedicated to fight this transnational crime, because that's the only way that you can tackle this issue.
I think as well, with you mentioning the financial aspect earlier, most of the money in these places is coming in from buyers with the expectation of, I'm here to purchase sex beyond a massage. And so it would completely overturn the entire business model and understanding if sexual services weren't being offered at a lot of these places. And so I think that is definitely curbing and keeping most of these businesses from putting all kinds of things in place that would prevent that, when that would eliminate the majority of their business. I think that your point earlier about the need for better translation and native speaking persons involved in communications with victims and informing government and law enforcement is so crucial. For people who might want to go into more of this kind of work, or someone who is a South Korean American who has a heart for this and might want to get trained, or for someone in law enforcement who is like, I would want to bring in this kind of training. Is that something that you offer, or that you know of where they could be pointed to?
So so what I can do, I'm just a one person. So I do train and consult the law enforcement, and I can help the law enforcement understand how to go about these organizations without traumatizing the victims, or without getting the victim involved in the process. So a lot of time when the victims are having to testify against the traffickers and relive this life to say what happened to her and whatnot, that doesn't really serve the victims very well. It only discourages victims, so to speak, to speak up. So, but on the other hand, we really need to, if we want to fight sex trafficking, we need to go back to and go after these trafficking organizations. So my recommendation is to, again, strengthen the law enforcement that can carry out creative techniques like using money laundering or visa fraud or other organized criminal activities investigation that's not involved in victim's testimony or victim's name. And the other thing I recommend for the service providers, the nonprofit, is that instead of the Asian victims have a very different need than the domestic victims. So now we have a lot of, for instance, alternative court, human trafficking court. They're serving the domestic victims. They're getting the counseling and the treatment for drug, to get rid of drug dependency, or to get rid of their unhealthy relationship pattern with their pimp or traffickers. That's not what Asian victims need. Asian victims need the money to pay off the debt, the money to support their family, the money to protect their children from the traffickers by paying back, or and also the legal services to help them get the civil compensation from these traffickers. And I will tell you one story that happened to one of the Chinese victim from New York. She committed suicide. She obviously was very ashamed and embarrassed, just like every other Chinese victim in massage parlors. And she was running away from the law enforcement because she didn't want to be around law enforcement. She doesn't want anybody to know that she has been involved in prostitution or brothel. So, but her lawyer had mentioned that she wanted to open a restaurant after paying up the debt. She wanted to bring her family from China, and then she wanted to save money to open up the restaurant. That tells me her primary desire or the primary goal to be in prostitution is really not prostitution. If she was doing prostitution and she's happy, why would she want to save her money opening of the restaurant instead of the brothel, right? So these details tell me that what the Asian trafficking victims need is really money to survive, money to protect their family, money to get out of the bondage, as opposed to domestic victim has very different needs.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I know of very few organizations or safe homes that have ever directly served Asian victims of trafficking in this country. And at times, I imagine they're wanting to return home rather than stay in this country. But if they are wishing to stay in the US, there definitely needs to be more education around the specific kind of and cultural understanding, not just applying what we know about domestic victims to victims from other countries and cultures, which is kind of across the board, I feel like. That's, yeah, something that I think there's just across the board a need for greater training in how to prosecute, how to reach and provide services and support to the women, and then how to best assist them if they are coming out. If there is a police raid, for example, instead of the women then just being moved to another brothel, we need to have partnerships with law enforcement and agencies so that they're able to refer the women to agencies that can support them either with immigration, either residing here or returning home, financial support so they aren't just left destitute, completely vulnerable to being re-trafficked. And many of the women that we met in the massage parlors were mothers, had children back home, and that some of them they hadn't seen for years. And that was one of the most tragic elements about it for me, is just seeing how they were either saving up the little amount of money that they were receiving to send back home and support their child, or they were staying here with the hope that they would eventually be able to bring their child over here. And you just know that what they're being exposed to day after day, not only the violence of the traffickers trafficking them here, but the sex buyers and the trauma and distress and violence that they're subject to on a daily basis is very real. And yeah, I really, if you have any resources that you could point to or that we could share in the coming days and weeks about how us within the anti-trafficking movement can learn more about this, because the Chinese women that I trained to go in with me, they were looking to me to train them. And most of my experience, apart from working in Asia, was with domestic victims or adults in prostitution here. And I was looking at them to give me the cultural training that I needed to be aware and sensitive of the different dynamics taking place that I wasn't aware of. But I do just think it's so important to have people who are speaking the language of the victims, and building connections where they do have someone that they could trust or that they could turn to if they're in a situation where they are wanting assistance, even if that is rare for them to reach out in that way. With you mentioned earlier, and I think people might not be fully aware of, you were saying about through visa fraud or money laundering, that being a more straightforward or easier route to prosecute because it doesn't need the victim's testimony. Can you talk a little bit more about that for people who've never even heard of those things or concepts before?
Yeah, so what is, so I guess I need to explain what is money laundering. So money laundering is any criminals, it doesn't matter if it's sex trafficking, it doesn't matter if it's drug trafficking or visa or just robbery, anything that has anything to do with the illicit profit. The way you hide your illicit profit, anytime people commit a crime, there's something called money laundering when they make a profit off of these activities. So when you go after money laundering, the pockets of the organized criminal, you're able to trace the network of the people, even the victims are not aware of, because the only trace that the traffickers or the criminals will make is really the profit, the cash flow. The reason why I say this is because this is for several reasons. Number one, you wouldn't include the victim in the process, so you will leave the victim out of the investigation process. That's protecting victims from the re-traumatizing her, right? And him sometimes. And the second thing is when you go after money laundering, a lot of time victims, when I interview the victims, because the victims are not aware of the business model and the network behind the trafficking, victims are not able to tell the law enforcement or anyone that's investigating the case that what actually happened. She just doesn't know. It's not that she doesn't want to tell anybody, she just doesn't know. So just like, the restaurant owners will not always tell everything and all the operational needs to the waitress, right? waitress, just wait, right? Same thing with the brothels, that when you're running the brothel, you're not always gonna tell every single detail to the victims. So, but then if you go back to the trace of the cash flow or the money laundering process, that's when you're able to find the sponsor or the investor who's not necessarily visible to victims, or even sometimes the manager. So I recommend that you go after money laundering instead of focusing on the victim's testimony. When it comes to visa fraud, in terms of the organization who commits visa fraud either work with organized criminals, or they're organized criminals themselves, or the brokers work closely tied to these organized criminals. So I say this, the visa fraud is very important. So this kind of becomes part of the trafficking death for the woman. So for instance, say if a woman, not so much these days, well, if the woman, these days, South Korean woman can travel to US for without the visa, under visa waiver program up until 3 months. But once the woman received the prostitution charges, then she gets deported. This is when other criminals can make money off of her to re-traffic her back to US or other countries by providing the false identity and visa documents. So when they're able to provide, or the trafficker consider that, okay, so I spend this much money on the broker so I can get you a student visa, I can get you a long-term visa, I can get you a marriage visa, she is gonna be charged $23,000 per visa. So that $30,000 is additional to the debt bond that she's already in. So I say that just because I call them as broker or facilitators or co-conspirator, this visa fraud people may not traffic this person directly and may not understand the process of the actual what's going on in the brothel. These people definitely make money off of and contribute to the overall exploitation. So that's why I say that you go after visa fraud as well.
No, that's so helpful. Thank you for explaining more about that. Do you have any thoughts or comments regarding the connection between pornography and sex trafficking, specifically in the notion of the fetishization of Asian women sexually? Any insight or thoughts on that?
So Asian women in general, I think they've always been, because of I will say ours, because I'm an Asian too, there's history of Confucianism that directly targets submissive attitude of women in general to the men. So based on their cultural upbringing, woman is not allowed to talk back to a husband. Woman is not allowed to talk back to older men. Woman is not allowed to talk back to their sons, even when they get older and become grandmas and senior citizens, right? So that starts off of already like oppressing women in general. From that background, add the element of prostitution that really, I don't know when it started, but let's go back to military occupation, which was 1950s or so. So 1950s, as opposed to the whole concept of women, men are better than women. A woman needs to be submissive to men. That whole concept of the submissive woman exists since 1300s, right? So they already have a long history of women do not have equal rights. And then they're adding the prostitution as another element to objectify the women. So now, this is probably why they don't have any issues with creating pornography or sexually abusing women. And in fact, I know some couples who got married because she was raped and she didn't have any choice. It's not because she's in love. She got raped, and this is Korean couple. And I heard it after they became a lot older from the women. And this is very this is kind of taboo, it sounds like, from the Western perspective, but it sounds like that's not out of the norm in some cases. So that tells you that where women stand. And looking at the concept of status of woman from the Asian culture, and then you look at the pornography, and then you look at the extension to the other sexual activities, you can't really argue that the women are not identified or objectified.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't know if you've ever heard of this or seen this, but there's been some Pornhub titled videos and channels. Exploited Asian Teen was the title of a channel of videos, and we were seeing videos not just from Asian victims in the US, but in Asian countries as well. Clearly non-consensual material of women being drugged or raped or exploited, like the title of the channel, Exploited Asian Teen. And it's kind of over here seems to be just what we're seeing, and it's part of the larger conversation in pornography. You can package anything as a fantasy, as long as it's not real. The fantasy is fine. And we've been like pulling back the veil, showing, well, it actually isn't always a fantasy. It's often real. It's often a real abuse. And also the whole thing of acting out pornography, it is real sex acts taking place. It's not like a stuntman on a movie it's acting. It's like even in pornography studios, it is real, the real sex acts that have real damaging effects often on the women and those involved. I know from, I have Japanese family, my uncle married a Japanese woman, so my cousins are half Japanese, they've always lived there. And I've had a lot of conversations about the cultural aspects between genders over in Japan. And I also think it's very interesting and tragic to me that some of the most violent pornography has come out of Japan, and some of the most violent pornographic terms are Japanese. And it's very disturbing to me that it's being presented as and packaged as this this fantasy of the gender dynamics that you mentioned earlier, with that the submission and dominance, and exaggerated in violent and degrading ways, and racist ways. Like the titles of many of these videos use Asian slurs and derogatory terminology, and they're packaging that as part of the fantasy, which we know in pornography, violence and domination is part of the fantasy for many people. And so I think when the conversation around racism has been coming up, I've been trying to direct it towards this, of the racism in pornography and the stereotypes and the very disrespectful, misogynistic, I guess that's the intersection between racism and misogyny is marketed in porn as a fantasy. And then sex buyers are wanting to pay money to act that out. And traffickers know there is a business to be made and are more than willing to exploit that and build a whole business model over it. But those are some of the things that we've been just internally processing at Exodus Cry. I wanted to ask you why, you said earlier, or just before we got on this recorded call, about California and Nevada being two major states where a lot of trafficking is taking place in the Asian community. Why do you think that is?
A lot has to do with the familiarity to the Korean community. So a lot of women don't speak the language or understand the American culture. And some parts of LA, you can actually get away with not speaking the language and understanding the American culture or assimilate to the main culture, and then you can survive. And a lot of the recruiter from for the traffickers, I recruit these women to Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is someplace you have a lot more Korean population.
Sure.
So I that's one of the reasons why California has a bigger market than others. With the Nevada, it attracts a lot more trafficking victims, and especially not the trafficking victims, the brothel owners. because some parts of Nevada is legalized.
Mhm.
Prostitution is legalized. So that opens the leeway to lots of operators, traffickers, or the facilitators to run the brothel without worrying about the law enforcement
Mhm.
regulation.
It's so interesting about that in Nevada, because it's actually only 10 counties in rural Nevada that has legal prostitution and the legal brothels, but many people assume it's legal statewide, and Las Vegas has a huge trafficking problem, even though technically it's still, prostitution is still illegal to buy sex there. We would often find the women that we were connecting with in the Midwest, they would be moved, or they had just come from either Nevada and California, consistently came up. And so it seemed often that between California and Nevada, and then the Midwest or the southern states, there was this movement like we were speaking about earlier. Yeah, just to kind of wrap up really, how have you been processing the last week with the events in Atlanta? And is there any commentary on those events that you would want to share, or yeah, what has that process been like for you and other Koreans that have seen this horrific act of violence take place to 6 out of the 8 being Korean Americans?
I haven't really spoken to, there aren't that many Korean women working in the sector. So I haven't really been able to spoke to Korean women in the sector, but I have been approached by a lot of Chinese Americans who are very active in this space, and they come to me for a shoulder to cry, and they're frustrated, they're angry and upset and hurt by the incidents. And I do think that in some ways, some Asian populations are being, so to speak, deceived or manipulated by the mainstream media agenda, which they're trying to promote this as a racism, as opposed to racism or hate crime, as opposed to this is a problem of sex trafficking. It's a problem of prostitution. They don't want to discuss that, and they're trying to overshadow the more of a bigger problem, where they organized crime or sexual violence or sex trafficking, and then kind of painted more of like other agenda that's important to certain people. And that really angered me. And the other thing is, I've been praying and asking God as a Christian that how do I make the best out of it? How, not in a sense that I'm going to utilize for my own glory, but it's just, I feel very responsible. I do feel very responsible as someone who speaks the language and who understands the phenomena. And I am the only Korean woman that I know at this point. And I mean, I know there's some people who does this work, and but I don't think she has been really closely working on this issue as much as I did. So I feel responsible to share what I know, working with the Korean survivor of sex trafficking, who are now willing to share their names, who are now willing to come forward for very good reason, probably because of their culture. And I just feel overwhelmed by this lies surrounding the issue. So that has been really challenging for me. And thankfully, God's been gracious, and people are coming, reaching out to me and looking for the truth, and wanting to do something about it. And Georgia State has been great, and they want to resolve the issue right away, and they want to train the law enforcement. They want to move forward. They're looking for a solution, and that was really encouraging. And a lot of Asian American organizations are getting together to resolve the issue. And my desire and hope is that they will present it for what it is, as opposed to kind of being shadowed by other agenda, or being deceived by other agenda that are promoting eventually decriminalization of prostitution.
Why do you think the media is shying away from looking into, or to even talking about the possibility of this being related to sex trafficking, when he said that he buys sex at these places.
I think, if you ask me, I think it's a spiritual battle. The biggest challenge is that it's a spiritual battle. Second thing is the mayor of the Atlanta, Georgia came out and say this is the least brothel. She doesn't know this is a legal brothel. She has no right to tell anybody. She's not Asian woman. She's African-American woman who grew born and raised here. Mm-hmm. She has no authority whatsoever to say this is racist, right? You can't do that. You don't let other people do that. Don't let yourself do that to other people, right? The second thing is that overall, there's a strong movement behind this, the decriminalization of prostitution, which sounds good in itself, but in actuality, when you legalize or decriminalize and not going after the brothel owner or the operator or anybody who's supporting the brothel business, the chances are literally the victims are gonna be immigrants most likely and the children. So I'm very wary of what is going on in terms of people are wild mourning and grieving over Asian victims' rights. And at the same time, they're promoting this agenda without understanding what this agenda is really consists of. So I guess my prayer is that the truth will get out there to debunk the myth, to fight against this lies. But they're looking a little deeper behind the network of the brothels in the Asian sex market.
Yeah, I know we're seeing that in a handful of states that have been considering and looking into introducing bills that would fully decriminalize prostitution for sex buyers and third parties, including brothel owners. I think a lot of people aren't, or lawmakers aren't thinking this through. And would they be happy at brothels opening up around the area in countries, say like Germany, that has legalized prostitution? You have drive-through brothels, and the desensitization in nations that have fully legalized or fully decriminalized, and purchasing sex, like as it stands, being a criminal offense, not properly enforced, in my opinion. There needs to be much greater penalties and financial penalties that can sew back into services for women in these states, which is what we see in the equality model or the Nordic model that does that. And but I think that removing the biggest criminal deterrent to sex buyers, which is the penalty, removing that, and then saying that brothel owners are managers, third parties are facilitators, when that's elements of pimps and trafficking. And yeah, it would mean that all kinds of businesses like illicit massage parlors could operate completely without impunity. That is a huge whole other conversation and thing that we are very passionate about and committed to, of raising awareness about the harms of the full decriminalization ideology and what it would mean for increasing demand for sex trafficking by normalizing that demand, and pointing people to the Nordic inequality model that decriminalizes prostitution for those in it, but heavily criminalizes the buyers, third parties. EqualityModelUS.org has been a really good resource of American anti-trafficking organizations coming together and trying to educate on this. So I'm really glad and grateful that you brought that up. It's been an emotional week for sure. I've been just feeling so deeply grieved by what happened, but really the reality that it brought to the surface of the plight of women in these places. That is something that I've been just really wanting to see become more of a focus from every angle. And so just to say thank you so much for your time and for the insights, and this conversation has been so helpful for understanding more of the elements at play, and really important conversations that need to happen, that need to be understood. Is there anything that you would say to the kind of the average listener listening that you would want to encourage them in, or say on this topic as some final thoughts?
Well, I mean, I don't know if it's final thought, but I do want to go back and address the issue of objectification of women and the pornography. So I was telling you about the historical context of what the women stand in terms of Confucianism, right? Based on Confucianism, women are supposed to be submissive to men. So women are not conditioned to speak up. They're not thinking of what they want, who they are. They're not thinking about what color, what, maybe not color, but like what kind of, do I want to engage in prostitution? Do I not want to engage, right? That's not the things that they're conditioned to think about. So when I go into this black market website that a whole bunch of Korean women who are forced into prostitution and they can't get out because of debt, they don't understand how much they have been oppressed, yet they express their grief against or depression. Some of them have signs of depression over the customers who are demanding these certain illicit activities and prostitution related activities. And just because they don't speak up, it doesn't mean that they consent to these activities. So when you see these women on porn site, just remember that, if not that I want to encourage you to go on a porn site, but remember their background, where they came from. These are not Western women who are, whose individualities are celebrated. These are women who have grown up with the values that already disadvantage women for the sake of being women. So for you to expect, or for anyone to expect these women, or assume that these women are doing this with the consent and engage in pornography and sex trafficking and whatnot, is not understanding the cultural difference between the Asian woman as opposed to Western women.
That's a really powerful point, and I would want that's something that our entire campaign this past year, we've been really trying to humanize the stories of the real women affected in porn, and drawing back the curtain, revealing that you have no way of knowing if the person in the video that that you may be watching in a porn video, you have no way of knowing that that person consented to it. How would you know? You might think that they're acting something out. You don't know that, and you don't know their story. You don't know the manipulation or coercion that they may be experiencing. You don't know the story of the real person behind the camera, and to really consider that, and to consider their humanity, and that for me is across the board, whoever the person is in that video. And we've worked closely with American-born women who were who look back and feel that the consent they gave, even in the porn industry, wasn't true consent, wasn't true, enthusiastic, mutually given consent, which is what true consent really is and should be understood to be. And the fetishization of Asian women in pornography is something that is very, angers me greatly, and I'm really encouraged to see more awareness of this, not only in pornography but in the Asian massage parlors. And my hope is that it by bringing this all to the surface, and there being a current national spotlight on this issue right now, that law enforcement, like you said they are doing in Georgia, are reaching out, wanting to receive better education. And for me, as someone who wants to connect with the women in a face-to-face way and offer them that love and support, come alongside them in encouragement, provide a lifeline, a safe and trustworthy person, I would love to see the anti-trafficking movement connect with Korean American women, Chinese American women, and think of ways to actively reach out to the women so that they don't feel so alone, and that they know that there's someone who cares about them. Thank you so much for sharing your heart as well as your expertise, and I'm just really honored to have this conversation with you, Youngbee. So I wish you all the best in your future writing, and you are a gift to this entire movement through the research and the understanding that you're bringing myself and others that you're speaking to. So thank you so much. It's been an honor.